All right, welcome back to another video. My name is Ian Major. I'm an entrepreneur, Bitcoin pleb, and all-around raging capitalist. And in today's video, I want to go into the Taproot upgrade. For those of you who are returning, welcome back, my friends, as always. It's great to have you. And you've probably seen me cover Taproot a little bit in some of my prior videos. For those who are brand new to the channel, welcome as well. It is great to have you here. I hope you enjoy this content. If you do, consider subscribing. It really does help get these important messages out to more folks on their quest to becoming financially sovereign, which is what this channel is all about. And so in today's video, I really want to use the Taproot upgrade. The punchline is that it has been sort of successfully gone through the speedy trial process, and so it is slated to activate later this year in November. So that's very good news. But what I want to use this as an excuse to do is to go through the actual process by which such updates are made to the Bitcoin software. One, it's fascinating in terms of achieving consensus about these updates in a decentralized fashion. But secondly, I think it's really, really important for hodlers and sort of anyone involved in Bitcoin to just understand how this actually works and happens, right? And then secondly, I want to also cover some of the implications. So what will Taproot actually do and what will it not do? Because there's actually a lot of different kind of privacy related questions and themes swirling around. So be sure to stay tuned throughout this entire video. A couple of you have asked really good questions that this video is partly in response to. So buckle up, it should be a good one. And with all that out of the way, let's go ahead and jump right in. All right, so before we jump into Taproot, let's first go through how updates are actually made to the Bitcoin software. This is a super important topic as hodlers, as really anyone using Bitcoin. And it's this kind of delicate two sides of a coin, right? On the one hand, Bitcoin's resistance to change is actually one of its greatest features, right? A lot of folks say, oh, well, it's so hard, Bitcoin's this stodgy old slow thing and you can't make any changes to it and, blah, 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 blah. Like that in many ways is a very, very good thing. It means the base protocol is stable and robust. And, you're not changing the underlying monetary policy of the token like Ethereum's doing and like many others try to do to kind of win favor in the marketplace. So that resistance to change is a core part of Bitcoin, right? However, the other side of the coin is that at the end of the day, Bitcoin is not just gold, right? A lot of people say, digital gold, but Bitcoin is programmable money. And so you can build additional functionality and features on top of this, rock solid sort of base level protocol. So both sides are really important, right? Resistance to change on one hand, making this really strong foundation for value transfer and settlement. But at the same time, we should embrace Bitcoin being programmable. It can become harder, faster, better, stronger over time. So in terms of like how updates actually get made, you could go to the Bitcoin Core GitHub right now. In fact, I'll link it in the description down below. And you could see some of the different projects that folks are working on. There are Bitcoin Core developers, often funded through, foundations or Square came out not that long ago supporting open source, development. You've got, some of these folks also just kind of doing it out of a passion project. Maybe they were very early, in Bitcoin and they're doing just fine now. And so, there's groups of individuals all around the world who are actually frequently contributing to the Bitcoin code base. In fact, anyone, and this is a really important point, anyone could go in right now and propose a change that would alter the hard cap, the holy hard cap, from 21 million to some other number, 25 million, right? Anyone could go and do that right now. But there's a huge difference between kind of proposing a code change and actually getting it implemented. right? No one would go for that. The users, as we'll discuss, ultimately decide what they want to change or not change in the system. And so the entire premise of scarcity is destroyed if if we violate that that hard cap and try to make a change to this most fundamental of rules. And so it'll just never happen, right? Incentives dictate that. But that's important to just be aware of and acknowledge, right? Now, there's kind of two types of code changes. There's what we might call the very minor, sort of everyday, little tiny things that an average user would never notice. And then there are what are called, consensus code. And these are kind of the really important parameters, different types of signatures, the block wars in 2017 regarding, should we increase the block size or not? These are meaningful, more major changes, things that can introduce new types of transactions. All of those sort of fall in this category of kind of consensus code. And for these, there's a very rigorous process that has to unfold for those changes to actually get into the network. So let's talk about how that actually happens, either in a soft fork or a hard fork. So let's start with soft forks first. A soft fork is more or less backwards compatible, sort of change. So a fork just kind of indicates, if you visualize this blockchain, and then, an upgrade is kind of a fork to the, existing change, right? So that's where the fork nomenclature comes from. A soft fork is a change that can be kind of agreed on a little more easily. The soft fork is kind of backwards compatible in the sense that someone running an old client or an older version of the Bitcoin software will see new blocks created with the new rules as valid, right? Contrast that to a hard fork where, anyone who kind of hasn't upgraded is at risk of actually accepting, invalid payments or payments that are kind of against the new rule set. And so that type of fork could go on forever. And so that's why it's a hard fork as opposed to soft. The development community and the Bitcoin community writ large really wants to avoid hard forks at any cost. There were hard forks very, very, very early on in Bitcoin's history, like 2012 circa. And then there have been the hard fork of Bitcoin Cash back in 2017 around the block size discussion. But for the most part, it's about avoiding hard forks at any cost because it's very difficult and tricky to build consensus around such a type of change without splitting the network into factions. The thing is, while it's messy, if a hard fork does occur, it becomes pretty obvious over time which chain won. Obviously, in the case of Bitcoin versus Bitcoin Cash, Bitcoin was the clear sort of winner. Bitcoin Cash exists to this day, indeed, but at a much kind of lower rate of market capitalization, adoption, and everything else. So let's come back to soft forks, though, which is where most of the action is going to happen, and indeed, which is Taproot is a good example of a soft fork. And so there's a couple different methods by which a soft fork can be kind of introduced and ultimately make it into the software. So, developers have written code and proposed it. And so what will typically happen, and what happened in the case of Taproot, is something called the speedy trial. And so this was part of Bitcoin Improvement Protocol 9, which essentially allows miners to kind of have the first crack at sort of signaling support for the change. And so how this basically looks is within a particular difficulty adjustment window. So this is a roughly 2-week period of time in which the difficulty adjustment is fixed. And so again, as a recap, like if the price is going up, that'll probably attract more miners into the ecosystem. However, as a result of that, the difficulty adjustment would revise upwards such that you still only have a new block being attached to the Bitcoin blockchain on average every 10 minutes, right? So the difficulty adjustment is about keeping that new issuance stable despite the influx or deflux of miners coming in and out of activity. So that's just a convenient sort of window to use. And in Taproot's case, if greater than 90% of the blocks being mined in a particular difficulty adjustment window were positively signaled for by miners, signaling here just means putting a little bit of data in the block that says, hello, I am, whatever mining pool, and, we're positively signaling support for Taproot. Once greater than 90% of the blocks in any 2-week difficulty adjustment window, then Taproot will sort of automatically get activated fully on the network in November. So we had a 3-month window for this kind of speedy trial to occur. And indeed, in this most recent difficulty adjustment window, greater than 90%, in fact, significantly more than 90% of the blocks positively signaled. So that's good. We'll come back to the implications for that later. So this kind of speedy trial is intended to for changes that are believed to be embraced by folks broadly. This is just an easier way to make that happen. And so essentially, once miners are positively signaling for this, then naturally this change will be implemented as consensus on the system, and nodes, in fact, will even be kind of notified and warned that, hey, the update is going to be activated in November. You want to make sure your node is updated. So for any of you running your own node, definitely be sure to update the Bitcoin Core client to embrace the Taproot upgrade. So that's kind of one method, right? The this kind of speedy trial approach that is very much based on miners and hash rate. There's also something called a user-activated soft fork, and this came into play a little bit with the segregated witness, update a couple years ago. But suffice it to say, this is basically if there's basically what would happen with Taproot if we never got that 90+% signaling is that after a year of that, or after some specified amount of time, that would essentially just kind of drop off, and it would have to be reproposed, and we would kind of have to start the process over. What user-activated soft fork does is it says, you know what, screw that, we're the users, we run the nodes that validate and verify transactions and blocks, and we're just going to go ahead and signal our support, and we're just going to update on an agreed upon date, and if the economic majority of the network does that, then miners are kind of incentivized to follow suit. And so this is a little bit of users or folks running full nodes. This is a bit of a way for them to kind of strong arm miners. So it is actually quite interesting. You would think, well, aren't their incentives pretty much aligned, right? Miners and those running full nodes and users, like everyone should just be supportive of whatever is going to be best for Bitcoin. But as you can imagine, there's a lot of folks involved in this, each with different philosophical thoughts and perspectives on the network and what is best and this and that. And so it's not always the case, and there can be kind of frictions between these two groups. But those are kind of the main approaches. Something called modern soft fork activation is sort of a combination of those two. So you kind of have this speedy trial window, and if that doesn't happen, then the developers will look back at the code. Why didn't miners positively signal for it? If there was something maybe that needed to be updated, they'll make that update and then repropose it. But if there was nothing wrong with it and users are supportive, then they would kind of be able to resubmit that, and then through a user-activated soft fork, nodes would simply activate the upgrade and start denying the blocks from miners who haven't upgraded, right? That's the power. Keep in mind that, miners package up transactions, of course, into blocks to be attached to the blockchain, which settles those transactions. But after they do the packaging and win the proof of work race, nodes still have to verify the block. And so nodes can just as easily say nope to whatever blocks that miners are proposing. And so miners have now just expended a bunch of energy just to propose a block that gets swatted away by the users. So, there's a kernel here that I think is really good. There have definitely been long debates on this, but ultimately the power really does sit with the users and with those running full nodes. And I think that's a very good thing. But it's fascinating, right? It's fascinating how this consensus is achieved, in a decentralized fashion in terms of these updates. That's really all I wanted to say. I know that was a mouthful on that section, but hopefully that makes sense. Again, we talked about soft forks, hard forks. Within soft forks, the different types of approaches, whether it's a speedy trial that's very much miner led, it gives miners the chance to say, yep, you know what, we're fine, let's just do it. And also the user activated soft fork method, which is a kind of backup plan if miners are, not really sure what they want to do or are against the upgrade for whatever reason that users with conviction believe is best for the system. So with all of that, let's now switch over and talk about Taproot specifically and the implications it has for Bitcoin. All right, so let's dive into Taproot. As I noted earlier, the good news is that it has achieved that greater than 90% threshold. And so it is now slated to be fully activated in November. So if you're running a full node, be sure to update that. But this is very good news. But what I want to do in this section is talk about what Taproot does and what it doesn't do. Because there are certainly some misconceptions, I think, about all the things that it can and will do. That I really want to put the record straight. So let's talk about what it does. Taproot's going to integrate Schnorr signatures, which are essentially going to just make Bitcoin's public-private key cryptography even more robust. That's kind of part one. That's good. Taproot also will add some additional privacy to certain types of transactions, namely around multi-signature transactions where there are kind of multiple participants coming to form a signature on a particular transaction. Keep in mind that this is how you open payment channels on the Lightning Network. So this does confer privacy benefits for Lightning as well, which is cool. There's also some, think of like a smart contract, like a hashed time lock contract, which basically says, hey, I'm sending these, Bitcoin and they can't be spent for, X period of time. That's an example of a very simple smart contract that exists today in Bitcoin. And so for each of these different types of more complex transactions, what happens pre-Taproot is that it's pretty obvious for folks who are surveilling the blockchain to kind of say, oh, this clearly is a multi-signature transaction, etc. And so that's obviously not great. It's not ideal. I don't want anyone to be able to discern perhaps what type of wallet I'm using or the type of approach I'm using or the type of transaction I'm conducting. And so Taproot will actually make these particular types of transactions indistinguishable from just me sending Bitcoin to a friend, right? That's very good. In doing that, it's also reducing the amount of data that is attached to those types of transactions. And what this does is it reduces transaction fees. So that's also good. Now, let's talk about what it doesn't do. There's been a lot of discussion recently about Bitcoin fungibility and privacy, and CoinJoin as a sort of attachment to that. So what is the discussion around fungibility? I've mentioned it in prior videos, but essentially fungibility, i.e. this Bitcoin is the exact same as this Bitcoin, is has been a very kind of fiery topic for a long time. At the protocol level, Bitcoin is fully fungible. That is to say, at the sort of technology layer level, this Bitcoin is in fact exactly the same as this Bitcoin. However, we are humans. And so once you add the human layer on top of it, there is a good argument that Bitcoin becomes no longer truly fungible. That is to say, let's say that this coin has a dirty history, right? It was associated with an address that some surveillance agency believes to be connected with a scammer or a hacker or whatever, right? And that would make this coin tainted relative to this other coin that has no such, nefarious history. Now, this, as you're probably thinking, is pretty unfair, right? Like if I have a coin that just happened to be, used by some malevolent actor a long time ago, like why should I be penalized for it? And so, just keep in mind that there are these chain surveillance firms out there that are looking at the blockchain, that are working with regulators, and hopefully doing things like trying to catch actual illicit activity. But you can quickly see how this devolves into just full-fledged surveillance, knowing who has what, etc. And so that's what a lot of privacy-minded folks are concerned about, and what they voice as concerns with Bitcoin. CoinJoin, as I've discussed in prior videos, I'll link some of that in the description down below, is a way to obfuscate and sever the sort of history of your coins, right? I'm not going to go into the detail of how that works in this video. I cover that in some detail in another. But suffice it to say that, if I'm coming into this transaction, I'm getting together with a bunch of other participants. And in the case of Wasabi or Join Market, which use this kind of equal weighted approach, we're basically each putting the kind of same amount of Bitcoin into the pot, and the pot swirling up, and then essentially the outputs of that transaction are unable to be correlated with the respective inputs. So in a nutshell, CoinJoin helps sever the sort of history of coins, but it is very obvious for folks doing chain surveillance to see that this was probably a CoinJoin transaction. Basically, they're very, very, very easy to pinpoint on the blockchain. And so what's unfortunately started to happen is you have exchanges who are actually approaching users and saying, hey, we noticed that you deposited some Bitcoin that appears to have a history of being mixed. Do you know anything about this? Like, what is the deal? What's going on? I'm going to link this great page from 6102 that has started to record instances of which such exchanges are doing this, along with some very good guidance on this page that I would suggest you taking a look at. But this is something we all need to kind of recognize that's happening. It's not all that surprising. We kind of always knew that the more this space progresses, the more regulators and governments are going to want to encroach and surveil and, keep tabs on everything happening. And so this is really unfortunate to see, but it kind of is what it is. And the unfortunate fact is that Taproot doesn't actually solve for this. Taproot does not make it so that a CoinJoin transaction is indistinguishable from a normal transaction. And this is due to a number of reasons. There's actually a very good Reddit thread on this that I'm going to link. But that's the takeaway, okay? Takeaway one is really that this attack on privacy is happening by exchanges, probably pressured by regulators or by the uncertainty about what type of regulation may come. And number two, Taproot doesn't unfortunately solve for this. I do think Taproot will pave the way for improvements in the future. It reforms some of Bitcoin's scripting language, which I hope would ultimately make this easier. That being said, CoinJoin implementations currently really don't use scripting. And so it's kind of like Taproot is solving for things outside of what CoinJoin uses to operate. But there could be different forms of CoinJoin implementations that that do use scripting that Taproot can positively benefit. We have to wait and see. But those are the main takeaways I really, really wanted to get across, because some of you have asked some really good questions on this. So yeah, what do we do, right? What do we now do? There are a couple options you have. You could mix and coin join part of your stack, and just like that's your ice cold storage forever. And then leave part of your stack unmixed in just in case you have to send it to an exchange for whatever reason, and whatever. You could keep coin joining and just kind of accept the risk that there are going to be certain third parties that may give you a headache for it at some point in the future. Keep in mind that there are peer-to-peer decentralized exchanges like HODL, like BISC, that are very, very good, although a little bit harder to use. And your other option is just not to coin join, not to mix any of your stack. And the pro there is that you're protecting against any kind of future headaches, but you're also opening yourself up to surveillance, and it's going to be pretty easy for any actor to know how much Bitcoin you have, assuming you've purchased it through mainstream exchanges. So that's tough. Kind of is what it is. There's no right answer. I think it really does depend on your personal propensity for privacy, and what you're kind of willing to accept in terms of risk on both sides. But hopefully that gives you the full picture and the full understanding of what Taproot does, what it doesn't do, and this important ongoing debate around privacy and CoinJoin technology. Let's go ahead and wrap this video up for now. All right, so there you have it. As promised, we covered a lot of ground. I hope you found this useful. Just to recap, we went into the mechanics of how updates are actually made to the Bitcoin software. Not only fascinating, but really, really important, I think, to understand, because you can now start to see why people talk about Bitcoin as being so immutable. It's not that it literally is incapable of change, but rather that there are so many incentives that protect against changes that folks on the network wouldn't want to see. Ultimately, it's up to the users, as we saw through the different kind of soft fork methods that were discussed. And then we talked about the Taproot update. The good news being that it successfully passed its sort of speedy trial. However, we also talked about the limitations and what it doesn't solve for, namely the kind of ever-present fungibility question. And so I'm still bullish and optimistic that we will see a lot more on privacy in the future. But for now, we'll have to just make informed calls on what, as individuals we're comfortable with in terms of mixing or not mixing. I firmly believe that everyone has the right to privacy. And so it's unfortunate what we're seeing, but it is what it is. So we'll go ahead and leave this video here for now. I hope you found this valuable and useful. If you did, you already know what to do. Give this video a like, comment down below with your thoughts, what questions you have, what topics would you like to see covered in future videos. All of that also really, again, does help get this message out to more folks on their quest for achieving financial sovereignty and independence. But for now, we'll go ahead and leave this here. As always, every sat counts. And until next time, see you then.